Welcome everybody, thanks for coming out here. This is the fourth iteration of the Interactive Narrative Design monthly meetup. We changed location to something also a little bigger because we've been growing and we felt the last location had become a little small. My name is Hartmut Koenitz. I'm the professor for interactive narrative design at HKU, the University of the Arts in Utrecht. And I'm joined by two guests tonight. We have on my left Geert-Jan, he's the director of the Medialab at VPRO.
That's correct.
Hi. And to my right, Mateas. He is he's professor at the University of Santa Cruz. He is famous for the first fully realized AI-powered interactive drama facade, and he's now working on a new system for content selection. Right, welcome. So, well, let me start by, I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you got into your current position, what your work is at VPRO, what your foci points are right now.
Sure, I'll try to speak up. A little bit of trouble with my voice, so I hope this holds up. I'm currently a creative director at VPRO Medialab, which was located in Eindhoven for the past 4 years. It was a kind of, it was part of the Innovation in Digital Media department at VPRO, and about 4 years ago we thought it would be a good idea to step outside of the bubble of broadcasting in Hilversum and see whether we could explore more easily all kinds of new technologies and explore their storytelling potential when we would be outside of the day-to-day need to create all kinds of broadcast titles. So we moved to Eindhoven, which is basically the technological hub of the Netherlands, featuring both educational institutions and like it was the hub for Philips for a long time, discovering all kinds of interesting new media like the CD, basically almost disappeared by now. So that was a good location for us to step and try to set up all kinds of collaborations with startups and technological companies there, and both do reporting on the developments there and try to figure out how we could tell stories with VR, AR, iBeacons and those kinds of media. Now we're back in Hilversum after 4 years of sort of exile there, and we're trying to figure out where to go next. Basically, we're looking into setting up temporary mobile labs across the Netherlands, trying to find projects that we can collaborate on and then just head out to the city of Utrecht, for instance, or maybe Rotterdam or Groningen, and set up a lab, a mobile lab there for like 2 to 3 months. So basically that's my task at the moment, finding projects, developing concepts, and then find a place to work outside of Hilversum again.
Right. You also have a hackathon coming up.
Yes. So basically developing projects at the Media Lab also involved setting up hackathons, each time taking a specific theme or an approach and trying to put together people from Eindhoven with people from Hilversum, from the broadcasting company who have experience in storytelling, and let them have a go at 2 days of prototyping, developing, coming up with interesting concepts, and presenting them at the end of 2 days to a professional jury and see whether there's potential to develop the project even further and maybe realize something. So by the end of this month, next month, the 23rd and the 24th, we'll be doing a hackathon, and the theme is called "The Future is Fantastic!" Exclamation point, question mark. So both sides of that fantastic future is to be explored, and we will be using speculative fiction to find ways of making the smartphone into an interface with the future. So basically that's what we're looking for.
Very interesting, and of course this is an invitation to join.
Absolutely.
And I think we can put in this video later the URL basically where to sign up.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Michael, you are actually right now located not so far from here in London. You are on sabbatical, so you're not in California located right now. And you told me you really enjoy being able to sort of code again and work on a concrete project instead of having to do sort of academic organization and being a department head and all of these stuff.
Yes. Yeah, so I've been on sabbatical living in London since September. Interesting times to be living in the UK right now. But I've been based at the University of California, Santa Cruz since 2006. Where I co-direct a research group called the Expressive Intelligence Studio. So our sort of research direction is artificial intelligence-based approaches to interactive storytelling in games. And my personal work is involved AI-based interactive storytelling and building both novel kind of AI architectures for supporting storytelling and then actually building fully realized interactive stories in the architectures and releasing them. So that kind of technical research combined with design, and sort of game design and interaction design research is what we do. Since I've been at Santa Cruz, I helped found a new department. So I was first in the computer science department there. And then about 5 years ago, a group of us kind of split out to form a new department called Computational Media, which sort of deeply combines computing with interaction design, arts, human-computer interaction, and sociology. And so that's that department's about, I think we're just in our 5th year now. And I was the founding department chair of that department, so which was very exciting to help launch it, but I've also very much been enjoying my time on sabbatical away from running things like that. And as Hartmut said, I've been actually doing a lot of programming. Kind of getting back to my roots of building big systems and exploring the possibility space of AI for interactive storytelling.
Very good. I mean, Geert-Jan, have you and your group explored the potential role of AI in news in the future? I mean, the role of machine learning maybe?
Well, as a broadcaster, obviously our first target is tell stories to our audience. What we've been exploring about maybe 2 years ago now was what we could do in storytelling with chatbots. Basically, they're powered by AI and natural language processing. And so we set up like 2 small projects that came out of a hackathon as well, which one was set up a small mobile game. It was basically a sort of double-blind Turing test. So it was called Bot or Not. We have an opportunity to chat with someone on the other end for like 2 to 3 minutes, and after 2 or 3 minutes you have to decide whether you're chatting with a bot or with a human person. And basically that's basically only the entrance of the game, because then once you're through the first level you get invited to impersonate a bot. So then you are challenging the next player and trying to convince them that you are actually a bot, which leads into a very complex thought process of trying to figure out how would a chatbot reply to this particular question. Should I simulate the chatbot doing an actual person, so I should not pose as an actual bot. So recording all those conversations brought a lot of insight into what people expect a chatbot to, how they expect the chatbot to behave, how they expect this conversation flow to unfold. So that was basically very interesting. And the second part was, and I think basically the people behind, it was actually hooked up to a 6-part television series on the rise of the robot. It's called Robo Sapiens. And so the second part was having an actual chatbot as a host in the website. So the website would not be just an actual website menu with teasers and stuff, but you'd have to engage in conversation with the chatbot to unlock information about AI and robots and about the series, and actually gain access to everything that was inside the website through the chatbot. And at the end of each episode, there was a sort of ethical question being posed on television. They would refer to the website, and upon entering the website, the chatbot would approach you with the same question, trying to provoke a dialogue on these ethical questions and lead you into a serious conversation, which was actually for us, it was quite a challenge, because we thought, okay, we have AI, we have like natural language processing, so we're set up, and so let's go. And in the end, basically, we had to do so much sort of broken up interactive storytelling within the and sort of pre-program several levels into the chatbot to be able to respond in like the first 5 to 10 questions and be able to engage the visitor into an actual conversation. But after that, some weird shit really happened, because there was a lot of dialogue that came out of it that we simply did not anticipate. And we were thinking like, did we put this in there, or did this sort of magically come up? And was sometimes it was really painful. There was a conversation where the chatbot would confront somebody on the question of, will robots take your job, really broadly, and it would approach someone who had basically recently lost his job as a result of computers just making his job obsolete. And the chatbot would simply confront him with all kinds of remarks that were actually very painful. So it felt a little bit out of control. So it was quite interesting.
So Michael, what is your take on that? I mean, is it still very easy to identify chatbots for, let's say, the layperson, or?
Yeah, I personally haven't experienced a chatbot yet that I am fooled by for very long. But I think one of the difficulties too is a lot of the framing for chatbot interaction when people make chatbots tends to be these very open-ended conversations. It's just like no context, no sense of like this, bot is supposed to be a particular character, and I think actually chatbot technology can be much more successful when it's designed to be like a specific character and there's kind of an interaction context designed for it. I find that these kind of chatbots that you're just supposed to talk to out of the blue about any topic whatsoever, well, we don't talk to human beings that way. Right? So I feel like it's kind of it feels like a really artificial context that like even, I think even most humans wouldn't necessarily pass the Turing test if they just were like talked to like out of the blue with no context about a random topic. If a stranger walked up to you on the street and just blurted something at you, you'd say, pardon? But that's sort of that's how we frame our chatbot interactions. So I think actually chatbot technology can be successful when appropriately framed. But I'm not quite sure. I think it's maybe some kind of like holdover from the Turing test framing or something that people keep on trying to do these like decontextualized chatbot interactions. And those I just find not very engaging.
Right. So I mean, you have to do with news professionally on that side, and you live in Britain right now, and you said these are interesting times to live in Britain. So if we try to reflect a little bit on the role of the media and of representations, do you see potential where, let's say, interactive forms of narration could improve upon ways we use reporting right now? Could there be new interactive forms that you both feel, could be an improvement in terms of, let's say, news reporting, documentaries, things like that?
I'd actually be curious to hear your answer first, since you work in broadcast medium.
Well, maybe I should tell you a little bit about a project that we did about a year ago. for which we actually did get some funding from Google. It resulted in an interactive podcast published through a dedicated mobile app. Basically, the thing we were looking for was how to solve lack of confidence in journalism that's very strong among particularly young people. And, so we thought, okay, how can we find a new kind of format for investigative journalism that would involve a younger audience. So we took like 3 young journalists and decided to go fully transparent in their approach. So they'd start out with a session of the editorial group, the editor-in-chief and the journalists, and they would discuss a particular topic and find different angles. And then the 3 of them would each take an angle and start researching. And they would make short 6-minute audio updates in the podcast and publish them as soon as they've were ready, like in 3-4 days. So this would be like a growing investigative network with short updates and just opening up their investigation to their audience. So they would actively seek help or input from their audience, make sure it would be quickly incorporated into their research. After like 3 or 4 updates, they would get back together, discuss their findings from the various angles. Also, again, in a podcast format, so a sort of open discussion that they would have amongst themselves, but broadcast to their audience, and then decide on the follow-up. And so this would be a process that you would be able to follow hot on their heels, so to speak. The mobile app would also make it possible to put out questionnaires during listening to the podcast, so we gather information that way as well. So it would seek a very interactive and open approach to this investigation, and it would have like 2 or 3 of those cycles and result in end reporting. And then they would solicit from the audience a new topic to tackle in the next round. So this would be basically not where investigative journalism traditionally involves diving into a subject, going underground for 6 months, and then come up with the finished story. This is something that would evolve out in the open and possibly in dialogue with the audience. So.
Okay, that sounds like a very interesting form of audience participation in creating news. Okay. So, Michael, how do you feel? I mean, do you see particular forms?
Yeah, well, I know one project that we worked on in my group about 5 years ago was a project called Game-O-Matic that was actually a collaboration with a colleague at Georgia Tech, Ian Bogost, and we were looking at the concept of news games. And particularly, so that the idea of news gaming is a pretty broad category, but there's sort of a subcategory within it, which is games that are kind of the equivalent of editorial cartoons. So, an editorial cartoon is very, short, it makes a rhetorical point, is not something you read for 5 or 10 minutes, you just sort of look at it and get it, right? And then over the years, there's been some experimenting with very short form games that you just play for like a minute or 2, and the dynamic of the game similarly makes like a pointed editorial point. And so we were exploring whether the creation of such editorial games could be semi-automated to a level that like lots of people could make them, because editorial gaming never really, there were a few, like the New York Times had some editorial games for a little while, but they never have really taken off as like a form in online journalism, because even these short form games take a week to make, 5 days to make, and need like a small team, including someone who's like a game designer and someone. And so we were trying to see if we could make an AI-based system where you could describe an argument you want to make. And so there was literally a little diagramming tool where you could sort of like diagram out an argument, and then you'd push a button and it would auto-generate a little game where the game mechanics purported to make that argument, right? And originally the concept of it was that we would then give this to journalists, right? And so that journalists could do, and I think at the end we ended up with, so I think for journalists they would want more control than the tool we finally gave you. Like the tool as we made it is you draw a little diagram of the argument you want to make, you hit a button, you get a little game, you can play it, and say, I don't like that one that much, or it doesn't make that much sense, hit the button again and it'll generate a different one, and hit the button again and it'll generate a different one, and that's pretty much the control you have, where I think a journalist would want to then be able to interactively iterate on a specific design, not just sort of roll a new game. So I think what we ended up with was a tool that would be more for like social media. You know, we kind of called it like the you know, in the same way that like back when there were still film cameras, the Kodak is Instamatic democratized photography, because you just like click a button, the film comes, the picture comes out, you watch it develop, that's it, you've got it. This was sort of like the Kodak Instamatic of game generation. That you could say like, here's a little game about what my day was like. You know, I had a really bad day because and you make your little argument, you hit a button, oh, that's a funny little game, boom, you hit the share button, it's on your social media feed. And so I think what we ended up doing was sort of democratizing almost disposable games that are just about kind of a emotional moment in time. Even though when the project started out, we first were thinking, oh, we're going to target journalists and this will be, allow them to make editorial games. So I guess I would still be interested at some point in going back to that project and figuring out, okay, we've got this game generator, AI-based game generator, but now we need an authoring front end that allows you to sort of interactively override in smart ways to really craft it, because a journalist is going to want it to be more crafted. So yeah, that's one area where we've explored that has kind of a journalism angle.
Do you agree that journalists would want more control for such a thing, or?
I was just thinking, as soon as you start going into all the details and the nuance, and then at first they really come up with all the things that you haven't thought about yet, and then you incorporate all those tiny little bits and elements, and then in the end it's too complicated and they don't do it. That's my experience.
Okay, so, all right.
You have to find some kind of middle ground there.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting.
And I've seen a lot of sort of formats that are basically really simplified in a way that journalists can really quickly and easily realize something, and then in the end they all want the complex, beautiful productions like Snowfall or something like something similar. So then the tooling just falls short of that, and then they're no longer interested. So,
so is there a disconnect between sort of expectations of journalists of what such a tool can do and then the reality?
Yeah, and basically we've done a lot of really complicated interactives. Last year we did the industry together with Submarine Channel, which was an interactive web documentary about the Dutch drug industry. It was a project that ran about 2.5 years before being finalized into the web documentary, involving research and the whole design process. And then basically journalists look at that and they think that's terrific and it's beautiful and it's great and insightful and you get the full picture and there's a lot of detail in it and a lot of research and data, and then they realize that that would be something they would want to make. And then we think, okay, then we have to sort of, if we want to use these kind of tools on a regular basis, we have to sort of make it into a useful tool and a set of tools that they can use. So we have to simplify, and then the point comes that making it simple loses the shine of the project, and they're more interested in these really complicated one-offs instead of being able to do it quickly.
Right. I mean, this is also something that we are, as a research group, are interested in. The question of how can we recognize really interesting, successful one-offs, but sort of abstract them and templatize them to something that could be part of the journalistic workflow.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're also working
for the core dynamics of this approach, and then being able to develop it over a longer period of time. That's something that, as a broadcaster, we are struggling with at the moment, because basically funding for these kinds of projects is becoming more and more difficult. So it's becoming more difficult to have a continuation of development in this area. So it's basically you get funding for 6 months to do this, and then you get funding for another project which is totally different for 5 months, and it's really hard to get those sort of lined up so there's some continuity in development.
I mean, Michael, I think you have been, sort of asking for procedural literacy to be much more in the education system. I think this sort of links up.
Yeah.
I think we have made progress in sort of, teaching people even, programming, maybe even at kindergarten level, and making people more understanding.
I mean, there's certainly more effort being paid now in bringing programming education into elementary school. I don't have a sense yet of just how widespread that is, and if that's actually changing, if it's actually creating broad procedural literacy, right? It's interesting that the rise of, with the sort of, like, I'm thinking back to the early days of computer hobbyists, right? So I'm the right age that I was sort of, learning to program in the late 70s, early 80s, and hitting that sort of, that generation of kind of early computer hobbyist technology. And it was very, like, you had to program to interact with it. I mean, that was just like, the interface was programming. Right, that was the, and it's been interesting to see, like, obviously I love using my mobile phone, and I love these, like, nice, shiny, slick interfaces that we have now, but they also kind of lock you away from how the device actually operates, and kind of creates you become a user then, like you're a consumer. You're a digital consumer at that point, but not a digital producer. I think there's been some interesting strides in, as I said, bringing programming education through things like Scratch into elementary school. But there's also, I don't know how to overcome this disconnect that when you use some of these educational programming environments, the kinds of things you can create are so much less flashy and developed than what kids are then seeing at the same time on their phones, for example, that I think it can be hard for them to bridge the divide that, like, oh, if I continue doing this, it actually leads to being able to make this, right? So, I think there's still a lot of work to do.
Well, it seems to connect to what you say to me, because, I mean, to a certain degree, I mean, I'm paraphrasing that, but you seem to be saying that many journalists then expect to be able to create something like the industry, but they want to create that in a week, 2, something like that.
Right.
Or even if it's a longer investigation, 3 months or something. And of course, I mean, I was a bit part of that project, and working with Mirka Doyne, who's basically the main creator of that. And I know how long this took, basically, right? So, and I think it might have to do with sort of the lack of procedural literacy and understanding how much work and how much programming there is.
Yeah.
So, I mean, where do you see a solution? Do we need more education in that? Do we need specialized training?
I think the most important thing is involving a lot of journalists in these kinds of projects. Even if you're doing a smaller project, it's also targeting innovation, then bring them on board and have them be part of it. For instance, involve them in a hackathon, which is changing their view of the whole process. and trying to get them to apply the learnings from a hackathon or from a project that took like a month or two to develop with them. They're taking those learnings into their own field and profession as well. I mean, for instance, like I think we basically 5 years ago, we started 6 years ago maybe, adopting agile work method and having daily stand-ups and stuff like that. And now they're everywhere. The whole post-it industry has basically taken over our company, and there are stand-ups and boards with post-its and the whole flow of developing ideas and topics has been adopted in their daily process. So being part of projects and developments is the digital department is teaching them to change their way of working as well, and they get insight into how complicated or how different this kind of development is. So that helps, and understanding the complexity of it, and also seeing the possibilities for shortcuts as well.
But so you feel that, I mean, do we need to hire one programmer or interactive narrative designer per journalist, basically? Would that be a solution?
Well, that, I don't think that's a realistic option, but making them part of that kind of team for a shorter period, or basically the other way around. We have a future affairs show called Backlight, Tegenlicht, and for about a year we had a creative coder which placed within their editorial team. So he was always part of development of topics and actually part of the editorial team. And now we see that they have taken on their own designer and coder. And they're not borrowing our people anymore, but they basically learned that it was important for them to have them close. So that's a good development, I think.
Okay, so things are changing.
Yes.
I mean, Michael, you and I, we're both academics, and we worry sometimes how do we have an impact, right, in the real world, so to speak, right? And of course, I mean, it's yeah, I mean, how do you see that? Where do you see, I mean, some of the graduates that you're producing, are they part of, you know, media industry? What are they doing?
Yeah, I mean, some of my former PhD students and master students have gone to work in the game industry, or to work in research environments like at Google or YouTube. And then some are, you know, continuing into academia. So I mean, that's one way to have an impact, is that you're helping educate people who go off and have an impact. But I also think that there's a role for academics to be exploring kind of the crazy fringe of what's possible. I mean, in a sense, I think that's partly what academia is. It's one reason why, like, society should tolerate academic researchers, basically, as a, you know, like, as a luxury good. What are they good for? Well, one of the things they're good for is, like in my work, I'm exploring kind of the fringe of what's possible in procedural storytelling, in like highly procedural and AI-based techniques for storytelling, and I've been able to pursue that as a focus for you know, like 15, 20 years now, right? And that kind of you know, and to have projects that last like 5 years. You know, you were talking about having to switch, like, I've got this 4-month project and this 6-month project. Well, I can have, like, oh, I've got this funding for 5 years, and we're just working on this thing for 5 years, and we're going to drill down on the hardest problems and get stuck in that. And then, you know, at the end of the day, we'll release some kind of demo, and, you know, of course, we're publishing papers along the way. But I think that's that's kind of like playing the long game in a way, is that you're having, I think it's both like a luxury, but also a responsibility to be pushing that longer vision. Because I think, you know, especially, I mean, Santa Cruz is very close to Silicon Valley. So, I mean, I can, you know, hop in my car and be at, you know, major Silicon Valley company headquarters in like 40 minutes. And so, especially with that sort of proximity and that amount of money in it, I think about, like, if I'm doing anything that could be done in like 8 months or a year, Well, 40 minutes away, there's someone with like a $400 million budget who will decide to do that in 8 months. And it's like, well, that's not what I should be doing. I should be doing the thing that takes 10 years and seems too crazy for any of those Silicon Valley companies to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in. So I guess that's it's a little bit of a long-winded answer to impact, but I think it's another form of impact that I think academics have.
I think this is a legitimate role of academia, and one that sometimes gets a bit forgotten in public discussion. What is the impact? If the discussion is always about the current need of industry, I'm always concerned about that personally, because I feel, well, even if we listen to the current need of industry, that we produce graduates in like 4 years, then the current need of industry might have shifted. So we're already in a bad position if we do that. But I mean, having said that, I mean, is there something that you wish academia would focus more on that would help you in your work?
I actually wanted to respond to this sort of long-term and fringe development, because basically I think that's not on a 10-year stretch, but basically the way we set up the Media Lab was just to be able to do this, to research the fringe of storytelling instead of having to do it in a very applied way that would simply be the day-to-day thing we would do at VPRO Broadcasting. Basically, of course, from our core, we are a broadcaster. We're not an innovation startup or we're not academia. So everything that comes out of that we're looking at to innovate is basically powered from broadcasting and telling stories to an audience. So within the company and the innovation and digital media department, everything that we sort of conceptualize has at some point has to bend back to some sort of product and realization and connecting to the stories that we tell on a daily basis. So that's where the Media Lab comes in, to be able to not look at that applied level of storytelling, but go to sort of the next level and look at a broader horizon. So basically that's the same sort of approach and the same sort of fringe media that we're looking at.
But I mean, maybe, the way I hear you and I hear Michael,
so
maybe
to hook up with your question, actually, I'm not sure if I can identify that perspective yet, but there's a definite connection from the Media Lab and the academia where we have to meet up. And that's basically also why we were looking at Eindhoven, because there's Design Academy, there's Fontis, there's and there are the technological companies that are developing new stuff. So there's the potential of putting it all together in the blender and then trying to figure out together what the possibilities are.
Yes, and that's of course what we are open to, as I think in general as academics. Maybe there is sort of like a fringe that still has to be concrete within, the setup of a broadcaster, and an academic fringe that can look even further ahead. Yeah. Maybe it's a difference between looking 10 years ahead and looking 20 years ahead, or something like that, to put some sort of a number to that. But yeah, I think it's very interesting that we come from different perspectives on what is the future of storytelling, of interactive forms of narration, basically.
Just bending it back to the broadcasting part. I don't know if everybody here is familiar with the Dutch broadcasters and VPRO in particular. But we've been making television and radio and always exploring the fringes of what storytelling can do within those media. And I think over the past few years, maybe the past 6 to 8 years, we've been trying to find ways to involve and incorporate our audience much more than we used to do before. Traditional VPRO media makers would know perfectly well the kind of story that they were aiming to tell, and they knew their audience, and they knew the stories that the audience needed to see and hear. and basically that's not the way we make media anymore. So you really need that audience. You need to make them part of the story. So that's where interaction and immersive storytelling comes in. I think immersive storytelling is way more important than VR only. It's basically a way of giving agency and freedom to your audience to be part of your story and to play a creative role in your story. So that's basically your field of research. So that's immensely important for us as well to explore that.
And I mean, to me, it feels good to hear that from somebody, from a broadcaster, right? Between us who are like, some odd ones out on a fringe of what used to be a fringe. So, I mean, do you also feel that it becomes a little more mainstream work in interactive narrative?
Yeah, I certainly, from a games industry perspective, it's being talked about a lot more, and particularly procedural narrative. Not so much in the AAA game space, but in the indie game space, there have been a lot of interesting commercially released games that are making use of more generative narratives and AI approaches to narratives. So I kind of feel, I do feel like there's a whole new level of interest in interactive storytelling than there was, say, 10 years ago. And I mean, that could just be, I'm not sure what's driving that. If it's that as game culture, game culture used to be a thing that was kind of a subculture. It was like gamers, and then most of the population weren't gamers, and now game culture is mainstream. Like, and people, as many people play games as probably read newspapers now, or watch television, or what. And so I think with that kind of mass experience of that kind of interactivity, it's kind of paved the way for people to expect that level of interactivity in other media forms that they participate in. I mean, that's my current hypothesis as to why interactive storytelling is suddenly so big.
Well, it feels good, I have to say. I'm happy about that. Let me, finish this round. After that, we will have some Q&A. But I mean, maybe both of you can think about one project, one kind of game, one interactive narrative project that you like right now.
Well, I mean, there's one I've just finished, which isn't very procedural, but I enjoyed, as What Remains of Edith Finch. That I thought was it's a fairly traditional, kind of location-based storytelling, but with these interesting kind of narrative mini-games. And the narrative mini-games embedded, this sort of sequencing of narrative mini-games I found really compelling. And I've done some experimentation in the past myself with the idea of narrative mini-games, so I thought that was interesting. And then there's a game I've just started playing called Cultists Simulator, which is which is much more procedural, which is kind of a digital card game. The interface is sort of a card-based interface, maybe a little bit like Reigns or something. But it's about sort of experiencing kind of cults and conspiracy theories in this sort of very generative space. And so that's sort of playing more with, where Edith Finch is much more kind of immersive 3D world and stuff. Cultists Simulator is much more abstracted with this sort of card-style interface, but then it's allowing kind of a level of recombination and procedurality that wouldn't be possible in a more 3D realized world. So those are two that come to mind.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Geert-Jan.
Well, it's immediately hooked by the location-based thing, because it's actually also something that we're exploring at the moment. We did a location-based project called Home Smart Home at the Dutch Design Week last year, which was a sort of immersive experience where you be smartphone guided through the house of an elderly lady, and you have to sort of figure out that something is wrong there, and so it's really inspiring, which is something that we're exploring now in a new project which will be sort of mobile somewhere in the country. And it basically also, it's again smartphone guided, hooking up with a system in the background that will both guide you and record you and collect your data and do kinds of weird shit with you. And the whole location-based thing is, we're exploring that now, but it's really a difficult area for us as broadcasters to go into, because how do we get an audience for that? How do we translate it to hook up with traditional media? How do we make it into a cross-media experience? So I'm not really sure where this is going to go and whether it's something that will deliver for us, but I still think it's really interesting. And also not in the least because it keeps hooking up with an event that happened when I was about 17, I think.
Okay.
Which is a very sort of mythical event in Dutch radio broadcasting, where this radio maker did a sort of storytelling event on live radio, which triggered his audience to get into their car and start driving, following his live radio instructions, and who collect at some point in the Netherlands where they would have to cross a river. They would get into steel boats to get across, and it was like a sort of proto-flash mob thing. And this whole location-based guided event was so powerful, and I think that comes really close to what we're exploring now. So it's coming sort of full circle.
All right, very interesting.
To follow up, if I could, on that. So I'm wondering, since you were mentioning you're doing some work, VR-based work and so on, and what do you see as the sort of interactive story potential of VR versus AR? And so, because I have to admit, for me, I'm much more excited by AR than
Definitely,
VR.
yes.
And I was wondering if you shared that.
We started, the VR research was started immediately when we opened up the Medialab. So like 4 years ago, and we explored it for a year and a half and then abandoned it in favor of, first of all, trying to do stuff with a HoloLens. And then moving on, just letting that go and moving into AR and live experiences, smartphone guided, which is much more, in a way, much more engaging and immersive than VR is. And the only really gripping VR is the VR where you actually have agency, which forces you to create a location-based installation in which you are actually free to roam. And that's the only sort of interactive VR that actually works for me.
Yeah. Okay. It's interesting. I saw a project that a while ago at Georgia Tech that all was a VR-based thing, but you had to crouch, where they built like a whole environment around that, and that made it feel very real. So I totally understand what you're saying. And there's also an interesting project that was realized by Hogeschool van Amsterdam, where you were put on a tightrope. And that was also, and you were on an actual tightrope. It was just like, hardly off the ground basically, but it felt very real in this VR situation. So it seems such situations can work, but other than that, I absolutely share that I feel there is so much more potential with AR than with VR.
And what I mentioned, like the one-on-one connection between immersive storytelling and VR, I think that's totally wrong. I think immersion is so easily achieved. I mean,
in other ways.
In other ways.
Yes, I agree with that.
It's much more about the story taking hold of you and immersing you in the storytelling than whether it's visual and whether it's all around you. Or it's much more about the interplay of story and projection. So. And
I mean, it opens up a space for you to put yourself in.
Okay, let's wrap up this round for now. We'll have now a 5-minute break.